SAT writing video, and in this we're going to look at punctuation. Essentially, you need to know a number of rules, so it's going to test your knowledge about these grammatical conventions, and it's going to check whether you can identify which grammatical convention is to be applied where. So essentially whether you can apply the rules appropriately. So there are things you need to know, and that's what most of this video is going to be covering. There are of course examples and sample questions as always. We are looking at the following so let's start with basic punctuation. Periods ending a sentence, question marks ending a sentence, but if the tone's inquisitive, that's when we use it. Exclamation marks similar, but if the tone's astonished or something along those lines. Speech marks convey a sarcastic tone. Say sort of a word in something, if I say it's colloquially known as, I could say speech marks this term. So colloquially over here is commonly. So if I want to bring up a new term that's not, we might use speech marks, and most commonly it is just used for quoting someone. Parentheses are always to add extra information about someone or something. So let's look at commas, right? So there are 5 functions I've thought of. One is separating dependent clauses from independent clauses. So if you're capable, you may be elected president. So if this happens, that will follow. We are separating an independent clause, and we are kind of that necessitates a comma. If you want to add a clause that provides more information, we use a pair of commas around that extra information. So he was voted president in 2008 when the financial crisis hit. So comma before when and comma after hit by popular vote. So if you were So one rule to check is the comma there will be one comma always placed after the term which it is adding extra information about, and one after the extra information is completed. So these the comma is only being used, this double comma, these pair of commas are only being used correctly if the information within these 2 commas conveys is about the term right before the first comma. So in this case it is about 2008, so it's being used correctly. And the sentence should always work if we eliminate the commas and whatever is between it. So he was voted president in 2008 by popular vote. So even if we do not read the commas and what is in between it, the sentence does make sense. So we can check we can say it has been used correctly over here. Listing before fanboys words. So these are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. There are many cases where we generally do use commas before these words if it is connecting 2 clauses. But there are certain cases where we are not going to use it, in like for things like ands. So if I say I like dogs and cats, I am not going to have a comma before and. So there are certain exceptions over there. And after introductory adverbs, so finally, comma, this happened, suddenly, comma, this happened, and even introductory words like meanwhile, however, nevertheless, if they use this in the introduction of a sentence, there is a comma after it. And a good rule of thumb when talking about commas is if a sentence makes sense, don't make it dense. Optimistic nihilism offers a positive spin to the orthodox ideology that all life and emotion are meaningless. The sentence makes sense, it is logically coherent, so I'm not going to make it dense, I'm not going to add a comma unnecessarily, yeah? If the sentence is making sense by itself and does not need a break, don't put that comma in. So this is an exercise. Pause the video right here if you want to solve it before I talk about the solutions. The first one is you just have to say yes or no whether the comma has been used correctly, and the second involves you actually placing commas. So I'm going to talk about these solutions now, so you should pause the video right now if you don't want to hear it. Has the comma been used correctly in the following sentences? First example, hi, my name is Aryan. Yes. If in these cases where we do have a word such as yes, I have done this, no, I have not done this, or in these kind of words we generally do use a comma right after it. You can apply the process of substitution when the exponent is not even. This is let's leave the context out, but you do not use a comma here. Why? Because the sentence is perfectly logical and coherent without that comma, so no. Humans have increased the concentration of greenhouse gases, comma, hence the temperature is rising. It is similar to how we would use a comma for fanboys essentially, and it is it is a valid use of a comma. I have pursued a major in business because that is my field of interest. No, once again, the sentence makes sense without the comma. It is logically incoherent without the comma, so we're not going to make it dense by adding that comma, so it's a wrong use for that. Now, in this exercise, we're looking at placing commas appropriately. So during the early 20th century, a time period which many associate with prohibition, Wall Street was booming, right? So obviously, we see that the break over here does not make sense. It is rather abrupt. So we can almost already tell that there has to be a comma there. And we'll also notice that a time period all the way until prohibition appears to be extra information that is connected to 20th century. So here, how we use commas and extra information comes into play. So we just have commas around it, and that is correct now. I committed murder, so I must face the repercussions. The fanboy rule comes into play. There is a so and a comma goes before that. Should I die, I want my eldest daughter Tiana to inherit my fortune. Now, of course, most people will immediately identify. You must have already immediately identified there should be one after should I die because of the independent-dependent rule. But something you might miss initially is that there must be a comma around. There must be the pair of commas around Tiana because it is providing extra information about who that eldest daughter is, and therefore you can actually have 3 commas in this sentence, so you got to be careful there. And the final one, it is simple listing, so you're gonna have 2 commas this one. Some people choose to have a comma before the and in a list. Some people choose not to. Honestly, they're probably not going to ask questions that specifically look at whether a comma should be used before the and, because the Oxford comma is not a universal grammatical convention yet. Now, when we look at semicolons, I like to think of it as a breed between a period and a comma. So you do use it to separate clauses that are very closely related, but do not have connectives in between. So in the last case, we saw I committed a murder, so I must face repercussions. We could use a comma over there because there was a connective. So by fanboys, we could have a comma before the but like we can't do that over here. There is no connective, and putting a full stop would kind of make them seem too different. So what we choose is something in between. So we use a semicolon. That's saying, hey, they're related, but you do need a break between them, right? And the second use is listing. So you can use semicolons instead of commas, though they're more effectively used if several elements in the list contain elements which contain commas, as in this example of Indian cuisine. That is one element of a list, which is a list itself. That is another list. So it is a collection of lists that have commas. So to separate these lists, we can use semicolons. Let's look at colons now. It is used to begin a list. Some poems I would like to recommend are The Raven, In Search of Evanescence, S and Porphyria's Lover. These are actually really good poems. If you want to go and check them, do so. But here I've used the colon to start a list and to add detail. So you know how you'd use a hyphen sometimes when you just use one hyphen. You can use a colon similarly. The weather was nice, colon, sunny yet breezy, right? So I'm adding detail, and there. Well, yeah, one thing you can't do in many places when we look at, like over here we have 2 hyphens that are adding the extra information. We can't replace it with 2 colons. A colon can never be used in a pair. It is always used by only one colon can be used in a sentence as a good rule of thumb. Anyway, hyphens are used for adding information in defining terms, just like how we would in the comma. So we could have said cells, comma, small structures consisting of a nucleus, a gel called cytoplasm, and a cell membrane make up tissues. Now, and a cell membrane, we could have another comma, make up tissues. But here it does get confusing because once again the additional information contains commas itself, and that can make it seem very choppy. So we can use hyphens as a better way to actually divide the sentence clearly. So there are substitutes for brackets over to like show that we're adding extra information here about cells very clearly. We're using them like we would use parentheses, and Once again, if you have two hyphens being used, you should be able to read everything outside the hyphens only, and the sentence should still make sense if it's being used correctly. So cells make up tissues, makes sense. But if our hyphen was placed after cell, for example, cell membrane make up tissues. Now that does not make sense because of these singular plural agreement issues. But that's but like the but if you want to see whether the hyphens has been placed hyphens have been placed properly, make sure that when you read everything outside of the hyphens, the sentence still makes logical sense. Second use is to add a new but relevant thought. So I committed murder, I must face the repercussions. So it is to add something slightly new. It's pretty similar to semicolon here, but I must face the repercussions. It is also pretty similar to a colon in this case. So you could say the weather was nice dash sunny yet breezy. So we are adding a new but irrelevant thought and starting a list like we did in a colon, like we did using a colon over here. So smokers are prone to a number of diseases and ailments. Hyphen, I'm starting a list: cardiac arrest, stroke, and various cancers. Apostrophes. Now, it is generally used to show possession, and here I'm going to talk about something very important. If the name, if it is a singular, if it is a singular noun starting with that ends with any letter but an S. So if John is the name, I would say John's, where the apostrophe goes before the S. If it is a name that starts that ends with S, so let's say Johnny's was the name, so JHONNYS, that's a singular name, right? So if I want to show that he possesses something, the apostrophe would instead, however, go outside the S. And when we're looking at, if I were to say if the noun is plural, so cows, if I want to say that it belonged to all the cows that are there, I would have the apostrophe outside the S. If I were to say it belonged to one cow though, it would be before the S. And there are certain plural forms of nouns that do not end with an S. So children is a good example, right? So children's is not the plural form of children. In this case, we add a apostrophe and an S to show position. So to show possession. So women's, men's bathroom, things like that, right? In the second example, we're talking about contractions. So it is apostrophes are famously used for contractions, and it is important here that I clarify the difference, important things between a number of contractions. So whose versus whose. In this case, it is WHOSE that shows possession. Whose is who is, right? It is a contraction over here. It does not show possession here, even though the apostrophe is being used. Whose does show possession. So whose pencil is this? I can say WHOSE pencil is this, but I can't say WHO apostrophe S pencil is this, because that would mean who is pencil this, which does not make sense. It's versus its. This shows possession. ITS shows possession. So its collar. I cannot say IT apostrophe S collar, because that would mean it is collar, which does not make sense. This is once again a contraction. His versus his. This is he is versus his. So his shows possession, but his is he is doing this. He's doing this, so he is doing something. Similar for she's or her. Her shows possession, but she is doing something. Right? So it is very important. So everything to the right of this list, shows possession. Everything to the left of contraction, where who is has been shortened to whose, it is has been shortened to its, he is has been shortened to his, she is has been shortened to she's. Now we're going to look at sample questions now that we have gone through all the rules that I assume you should know. This is a fairly long video. I apologize, and most of the writing videos are going to be long because there's a lot of theory. Anyway, back to the question. So you'll often see for this, to a random piece of text, you'll see a small square box with a number in it. So that will show you which question that part of the that sentence is concerned with in the writing section. So This says one, so it relates to question one. Only the underlying part of the sentence will be concerned or will be changing over here. So you just have to decide whether it needs to be changed, and if it needs to be changed, which of the options provide for the best change. In this example, in space astronauts there should be a comma over there, my bad. In space, astronauts experience weightlessness, but a spinning torus can generate a centripetal force or centripetal acceleration similar to what is experienced on Earth. So, solve this question. I'm going to disclose the answer now. It is there must not be any change. So a good thing to look over here is because this is a very long sentence. It's almost always a better idea to look at the options first and see if some definitely do not work before thinking about it. So centripetal force or centripetal acceleration similar to what is experienced on Earth. In option B, we have used two commas. These two commas are unnecessary. It provides the impression as a centripetal acceleration is providing extra information about something. We really do not need a comma around it around centripetal acceleration, because it's just breaking up the sentence for absolutely no reason. Now, once again, many people, you might be convinced to that, okay, all right, centripetal force or centripetal acceleration, it might look like similar to what is experienced by Earth on Earth, is adding extra detail about this. And yes, we need to separate the clauses here with a comma. No, you did not. A spinning torus can generate a centripetal force or centripetal acceleration similar to what is experienced in Earth. It is perfectly logically coherent without the comma, so we're not going to break the sentence. The only way you can develop a sense of when the comma is necessary is by doing a lot of practice questions, and many of these questions are actually modeled from SAT papers. So the only way really you can begin to identify if a comma is unnecessary or not is through practice, and in this case it is unnecessary. D, a colon, it's absolutely out of question. We're not, although we are adding extra detail, conventionally we do not use a colon like this. It makes it appear as it is pretty much unneeded for the same reasons as why the comma in option C is unneeded. It unnecessarily breaks a sentence or a clause that already makes sense by itself, and therefore A, no change is the answer. The second one is slightly easier. For certain industrial yields, high temperatures, anything above 300 degrees centigrade, can be reduce product yield. Now, once again, we already do have a very big hint over here. Because there is a bracket over here, it means that there needs to be another bracket to open the bracket itself. There is only a closing bracket. Therefore, we notice that anything above 300 degrees centigrade is adding clarity about what we mean by high temperatures. So we know that this comma should be replaced by a bracket, and we can almost immediately see that the option should be C. And a good rule of thumb to see if the bracket has been placed correctly or something is to read it without the parenthetical phrase, without the extra information. So for certain industrial processes, high temperatures, we jump to over here, reduce product yield. It does make sense, and therefore the open bracket is correctly positioned in option C, and it is definitely option C. We do not use a dash because then this last parentheses over here would need to be a dash instead, and we don't leave it with anything because then there is nothing to open the bracket, so that cannot be correct, and we cannot have one comma and one closed bracket. Therefore, it is pretty obvious that the answer is C. The third question, many argue that Olympics are financially risky and not worth it. Now, once again, colons are pretty much like commas, don't add it unless necessary. So the sentence makes perfect sense, even if it's just said. Many argue that Olympics are financially risky. Many argue the Olympics are financially risky and not worth the immense cost. It makes sense without the colon. We need to get rid of the colon. Obviously, since for the same reasons that we're getting rid of the colon, it is unnecessary. A comma would also be unnecessary, and in fact, incorrectly used if placed over there. We cannot just delete the underlined portion, because then the sentence would become, many argue that Olympics financially risky. That is grammatically incorrect as well. So we can clearly see that the option is B. And it is fairly easy. Most of the questions regarding punctuation are easy, but there are one or two, like the first question in these four that I've been showing till now, that are quite hard. This video is particularly long, so I'm trying to wrap it up now. In the city of XYZ, foreign citizens' assets are estimated to be worth $2 billion. Now we are talking about the assets of all the citizens within city XYZ, and therefore the parentheses comes after the S, and therefore it has been used correctly, and there is no change. And I cannot stress enough, really, as I've come to the end of the video, that it is exceptionally important to practice punctuation questions. Otherwise, you're not really going to get that sense of where it is necessary or which option is the best, because they do tend to be tricky. And in the next video, we're going to cover diction, which is something that is very important in the writing test. With that, thank you. So see you until next time.